Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming to my Pre-Viva talk on quantifying the distributional distance between synthetic and real speech. And we'll start out by, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, by defining the scope of this a little bit. So when I talk about synthetic speech throughout this work, we're talking about voice cloning TTS. So not voice conversion, not unconditional speech generation, and also not speech-to-speech models. And what we really focused on was not lexical content of the speech, because in a way, at this point for speech generation, that is the easy part, or should be the easiest part, but other factors of the speech we will get into detail later. And first off, let's address the fundamental problem that I try to address, which is that we have a synthetic speech distribution, which is parameterized by a certain model. Here, the parameters are just theta. And there's the real speech distribution, which obviously, if both of those aligned perfectly and very exactly the same, then the problem of TTS is solved forever and we don't need to do any more work on this. That is obviously not the case. But the interesting questions are, first of how far apart are these distributions, and in what ways do they differ? And this is obviously a difficult problem, since we don't have access to the full speech distribution that we theorize about here. And we would really like to know if there's some way to find maybe some proxy tasks or other measures to quantify this properly. So first off, of course, text-to-speech has been evaluated plenty before in many, many ways, but the gold standard still, even though there's criticisms of it, is subjective evaluation with MOS or some other subjective rating framework. And here, since a couple of years ago already, the results seem to indicate that the synthetic speech is actually quite close to the real speech. So within, of course, depends on which exact scoring system or metric you use, within about 1%, maybe 2% of the real speech. And recent works even have claimed to reach human parity or superhuman speech even, because there are some works that say that they actually achieve ratings that are higher than for the synthetic speech than for the natural or real speech. So does this mean we can go home and the real distribution is almost perfectly approximated now by these models? We look at this through a different angle. The first one being TTS for ASR. So TTS for ASR means we use synthetic data and only synthetic data to train a speech recognition model. And speech recognition obviously is in a way the inverse task of TTS. We just have the speech as input and want the text as output. And we hypothesize, at least in theory, if this distribution is this closely matched at this point, then training with synthetic data should be almost equivalent to training with real data. That's why TTS for ASR is a good proxy task in this case. And the setup for this is we start obviously with a real speech data set, which is divided in 3 parts. One of those is used to train the TTS model. Another one is used to train the ASR model. And then we use, as I said in the very first slide, we do not really care about the lexical differences in this case. So we use the transcripts from the portion that is used to train the ASR model to then synthesize the speech using the TTS model. And then using a third held out portion of the data set, we can calculate the word error rates of the synthetically trained ASR model with the ASR model trained on the real speech data, and what we get is what we call the word error rate ratio. So the ratio of word error rates that we achieve on a model that's trained on real data versus the synthetically trained model. And even though this was usually an ablation experiment for people and not what they were mainly aiming for, the nice thing is that we have results on this from the literature. So we can actually look at these word error rate ratios in the literature, and we can see 2018, I said the subjective evaluation was within a few percent of the real data. Well, if we starting in 2018, the factor, we're not talking about percentage points here, this is a factor, so it's 10 times worse than the real data, the synthetic one. And obviously this improves over time. But still, even the latest systems are at a factor of around 1.5 now, which means instead of 1 to 2%, we are talking about 50%. And a big part of my work was to investigate why that happens and if that can be improved. First off, we also want to get some things out of the way to check if could there be any obvious component of the TTS system that could cause this gap. So here the most interesting things are that first off, the synthetic speech seems to be very, very regular. So if you look at the synthetic row, we get really, really good word error rates, which is obviously points to some regularity in the synthetic speech that can be exploited when it is also used as training data. And secondly, when we resynthesize the real speech using a modern vocoder, hi-fi gun in this case isn't even that modern anymore, we get very similar results to using the real speech. So it's also, we can say, not the vocoder that is causing this distribution gap. Now the next question is there an intuitive way to improve this distribution coverage for existing systems? In our first work, we went with fast speech 2 and added several conditioning components to more accurately cover this distribution across several factors. So first off, we have attributes. So these are just common acoustic correlates that and prosodic correlates that you can find for speech. So F0, energy, speaking rate, and so forth. And we can sample those using Gaussian mixture models that are conditioned on the speaker identity, because of course each speaker will have a different distribution here. Additionally, we can also, people that are familiar with fast speech 2 might know that there are, these correlates are also predicted on a sequence level, and we add additional environmental correlates. So this would be something that sort of captures something about the environment, so that could be reverberation or signal to noise ratio. And finally, we also augment the final data. We know with additional noise or reverberation it might be common in real speech, because another hypothesis here is, what if the speech that's synthesized is just too regular? It might be perfectly approximating the distribution, but it doesn't simulate things like recording conditions or background noise. And the results show that these changes, apart from the initial environment change, do contribute to reducing this ratio, but not nearly to the extent that it explains the gap. And even when we use oracle correlates, so the correlates from the actual ground truth data, which we shouldn't have access to, the gap is still quite large. And now we start looking at this as well from a distributional perspective. So instead of just having these like final numbers for TTS for SR, let's look at some of the distributions of these different representations of speech. So here I've selected a few that are more in the paper, but these are the some interesting ones. First off, on the left we have a PCA plot of the speaker embeddings, and we can see that before and after conditioning there's barely any change. There's maybe slightly increased coverage, but those stay approximately the same. And I should also say here that the bright blue distribution is the synthetic one, whereas the orange one is the real one. So we can also see what we sort of expected, which means that the distribution is a bit narrower and doesn't cover the full distribution of speech, and at least with respect to these embeddings. And then when we look at the prosodic correlates, we actually see that the conditioning works much better here, whereas initially it's very obvious that these distributions are disparate, but after conditioning they match much more closely. So that is definitely a success of that method. Now, as I said, this gap is still very large at this point in time. So what else could be the case? Unfortunately, because it's not a very exciting answer, in machine learning, it's often scale. If we just scale up a model to a large extent, is that the issue that actually causes this gap? So, because for TTS for SR specifically, of course, there are TTS models that are trained on much more data now, but TTS for SR, these models are usually trained on around 500 hours of speech. And while that used to be a lot, maybe it's not enough to actually cover this distribution well. And we can also draw on some literature that introduces scaling power laws for machine learning in general, and specifically also for synthetic data. And in our next work, we tried to apply these power law principles to TTS for ASR specifically to find, even if we have just academic resources, which in this case means going up to about 5,000 hours of speech data for training, we can, using these power laws, we can hopefully extrapolate how this would behave with larger data regimes. And I will not go into detail here now because I'm conscious of time, but basically we find a two-term power law captures this quite well. The behavior of TTS for SR given different amounts of training data. And the first term basically captures the low data regimes, and the later term how it behaves when we scale up to thousands of hours of speech. And we also find that this power law obviously has different results based on which kind of model architecture and training paradigm we use. So here specifically we compare what was mostly used in literature, which was fast speech 2, which is trained using mean squared error, with diffusion models, which should in theory be better at approximating the distribution. And we see that there is quite a nice fit in both cases. But if we extrapolate this, we would have to go, which, who knows, maybe it will happen soon, to millions of hours of speech to get close to actually closing the gap completely, which means that scaling alone can also not solve this persistent gap between synthetic and real speech. I should go over the architecture of those models that weren't used there. In the case of, to compare just mostly the training paradigm, we use a unit encoder and decoder with prosodic correlates and duration in the intermediate representation, but I think I won't have time to go into huge amounts of detail there. So in terms of TTS for ASR then, we found that there is a systematic mismatch between the real and synthetic speech distributions, and we can quantify this through the TTS for ASR proxy task. However, we can only say that there is a large gap. TTS for ASR, we can't obviously map it to a one-to-one measure that measures exactly how far these distributions are apart. We can just say it does not work as well as we would expect it to given previous evaluation methods. And we find that conditioning systems well to capture more diversity and scaling and better training paradigms can reduce this gap, but it still remains larger than the original evaluations would suggest. So now we look, for the rest of the work, we look for a more distributional lens. How can we actually quantify this gap from a distributional perspective without the TTS for ASR proxy task, which has just told us that this gap is there and persists. So first off, let's lay down some requirements we have for any distributional analysis of this kind of synthetic speech. First off, it should be perceptual. It should correlate with some perception that actual people have, because if you can say in theory this distribution has this and that distance to another distribution, it is a nice finding, but if it does not correlate to anything found in the real world, obviously there's not that much value in it. And secondly, it should not be saturated, which is a big problem with subjective evaluation, at least in many cases, where this is basically what I've been describing, the gap becoming so small that basically real and synthetic data cannot be distinguished anymore in terms of rating, even though, at least as we found for this proxy task, there really should still be some difference that is found. And it should also be interpretable. Obviously, we would rather have a more nuanced and fine-grained view rather than one number that tells us how well is the distribution covered in this or that case. And also, one more point here is how we combine the perceptual and non-saturated requirements. This means that if we look at subjective evaluation like MOS or CMOS or preference tests, we want a correlation in ranking with those outcomes, but not necessarily in the magnitude of the scores or whatever kind of evaluation we use. So that means we would, for an ideal metric, we would like to preserve the same ranking that people give the systems, but not have the ground truth be extremely close to the best synthetic system when it actually, through downstream tasks, is found to not be as good as suggested. To this end, we introduced the text-to-speech distribution score. And here we come to the interpretability again. We divide the different representations of speech into 5 distinct factors. And we start out with what has been used in the previous literature already at some point, is to use a generic factor, which is the most obvious thing to do, basically. We can use WAF-LM embeddings, WAF-to-VEC embeddings, and so forth, and look at the distribution of those embeddings. But we extend this to further also include speaker representation, so these are from speaker verification systems, prosody, so again, prosodic correlates, but also self-supervised learned features from joint work with Seren. And intelligibility, so this could be word error distributions over word error rate, or activations from ASR models. And finally, the environment factor, which we already discussed in previous work, which can be background noise, recording conditions, and so forth. Now, there are many ways to measure distances between distributions, but what I landed on in the end is the Wasserstein metric. Basically, this has a very intuitive explanation, which is quite nice. We simply move all the probability mass from one distribution to the other, and the shortest path that can be achieved in is our distance. And this has some advantages over other distance measures, which we'll get into. And also, here's another visualization of what this can look like concretely using, again, PCA of Hubert embeddings for speech and synthetic speech in blue again, real speech in orange, and then noise, so just random audio basically, which is clearly almost no overlap between the two. And the advantages of the Wasserstein metric are that it is actually a true distance metric, so it is symmetric, which is one of the main requirements that something like Kullback-Leibler divergence does not satisfy. And then there are fixes for that, quote unquote, like Jensen-Shannon divergence, but Wasserstein distance is also well behaved if we have little or no overlap between the distributions, which will come in very handy on the next slide, or a few slides on from now. Because essentially, when we use something like Jensen-Shannon divergence, which is maybe used more often for training purposes or for getting these distribution divergences, it does not make a difference if there is absolutely no overlap between two distributions and they are still relatively close versus no overlap between distributions with a large amount of distance between them. So in both cases, it just goes to 0. And that's obviously not what we want. Disadvantages of the Wasserstein metric are that it often requires a lot of samples and the time complexity is quite high, although there are some tricks to work in latent spaces which come from the computer vision domain. If you're familiar with fractured inception distance, that they introduced a great trick to basically simplify this calculation a lot. Now, for the actual score, we use a lot of these distances and we calculate them between the synthetic speech and noise distractors, as well as the synthetic speech and the real speech. And this gives us a sort of ratio that will go from 0 to 100, because we just multiply by 100. And that way we can actually average across different distances, which is very important because otherwise the distance is just a can just be used to compare within the same latent representation or same distribution rather than between them. And additionally, we find that we need to average several of these scores together to get robust results, because, as I mentioned before, usually there are a lot of samples required for these metrics, and this kind of ensembling effect helps us develop a more robust metric. And in our first investigation of this, we looked at, we wanted to see, does this actually satisfy one of the requirements we have of evaluation, which is that it's robust across time. So we want systems from 2008, like on the left in the Blizzard 2008 challenge, to be predicted by this metric, but also the latest systems that just came out 2024, 2023, that were evaluated in TTS Arena, for example. And we find that we consistently have high and significant correlations, whereas most other metrics, as soon as they go out of distribution, because many of them are supervised as well, they are very unpredictable and varying results, and sometimes no significant correlation at all. Now, finally, when it comes to saturation, which I mentioned earlier as well, again, for this analysis with MOS prediction systems, we are very close to ground truth in terms of MOS. I mean, you will probably have seen these kind of MOS values in papers before. If you've read TTS papers, these are very similar to what you would expect from the ground truth samples to be rated as. However, TTS-TS only reaches 86 out of 100, which in this case is a good thing. And if we compare real speech to real speech, we get to 95. Obviously, we never reach a perfect 100 score, even if we compare real speech to real speech, because there is some natural variation. We don't have infinite samples to work with. But that is still 9% of the ground truth, which kind of correlates with the performance we see from TTS for ASR a lot more. Now, for the next version of the system, we asked if we can replicate these findings with our own listening tests, and also if this is robust across domains, because most of these past comparisons just used read speech, which we all know is quite regular and a much easier task than different domains. And we also wanted to improve the robustness of the representations further. And to the end of the last question, we essentially, without looking at any synthetic data, just did this comparison where we compare real data to real data from the same data set. And essentially, for a representation to be robust, it should score real data highly and noise relatively low. That's quite obvious, but it's a nice way to verify if these representations are actually robust without running the risk of overfitting to what we want the metric to do, to looking at the actual synthetic data results. So we only use real data to pick the representations. And we actually did find that some of the representations we had were not very robust. For example, Hubert tokens to approximate the speaking rate were not robust across the different domains, whereas Allosaurus, which you might be familiar with, which is a phone recognizer, using that to recognize the speaking rate, was quite robust across the different domains. To summarize, we used 20 state-of-the-art TTS models that were available as open source models, so we could actually generate this data. And on the subjective side, I know these are not the ideal, perfect subjective evaluation methodologies to some extent, but we did want to compare, keep the comparison to previous works possible. So we went with MOS, which everyone should be familiar with, and comparison or comparative MOS, which is basically just showing two samples side by side and asking for a preference, but on a scale, and SMOS, which is the speaker similarity MOS in this case. And we did this across 4 different domains, which were the clean speech, which is just LibreTTS. This is sort of our control, used in many, many previous works. Noisy, which is still read speech, but not filtered by SNR, so you'd actually be surprised how different the dataset is if you just take the latest LibriVox recordings and create a dataset from that rather than LibreTTS. It is actually quite curated, LibreTTS. In the wild YouTube data, and to have something completely out of domain, we also used the My Science Tutor corpus to have children's speech, because it stands to reason that most of these models will not have seen much children's speech at all, and we wanted to see if our metric and evaluation is still robust in that case. And now I will not go through all the results, but some selected ones. But basically we find the highest correlation on the clean data, which is obviously very desirable. But a lot of other methods also do relatively well. Here in the middle you see MOS prediction models. So these are supervised models that were trained on previous subjective evaluation challenges and works to predict MOS for future or unseen TTS models. The other distributional distance with the number of samples we had actually did not perform very well. So this shows that the ensembling that we do is actually necessary and going across these different factors. These are some more MOS prediction-like systems, and then frame-based algorithmic methods that were used in TTS evaluation many moons ago are predictably not great, don't show any significant correlation at all. And the other interesting case here is the wild data set. Here we actually find that what I barely talked about before, which is the speaker embedding similarity, which we also often see in papers, performs really well, actually outperforms our method. But most prediction networks fall off extremely, and it's basically a bit of luck of the draw which method you pick, if it will correlate or not. And some of the frame-based metrics now would actually be better if you just flip the sign. So these are clearly not working. And the main finding here is in some cases other metrics can outperform this distributional approach, but if you look across all different domains, it is the only one that is robust and in the same range across all the domains. And if we look at it in a bit more detail, we can also see here on the left the closest metric, at least on the in the wild data. The speaker embedding similarity has some strange clustering behavior, which upon some investigation, we found that all the diffusion models are basically clustered to the right here and show really high speaker similarity, which at the moment helps, of course, to give a good ranking. But what if all of the models are suddenly diffusion models? Will this still be a good metric? It's hard to say. Whereas we have a more sort of natural and spread out correlation. The nice thing is also that we can interpret the different factors, and we see here that while the speaker factor, which is in this case not speaker similarity, but the distribution distance between the speaker embeddings is very important for clean and noisy, so in both cases red speech, it actually drops off a bit for the other factors, and others take more importance, which again shows that this ensembling approach is potentially a good idea. Now, to get to the conclusions of this work, both the proxy task, the TTS for ASR proxy task, and this distributional analysis have shown that there is a fundamental distribution gap, and we could not actually solve this problem. It is still there. It is still something to explore why the real and synthetic speech still have quite fundamental distribution differences. And we should also think about modeling these distribution differences in the light of several different factors of speech. It's not because one thing, for example, as well that we found in ablation is that matching the environmental distribution exactly, so for example background noise and so forth, is actually not desirable for listeners. If you have for some models, for some cases it's actually an inverse predictor. The closer you get to the real data distribution in terms of background noise and similar things, the lower rated the model will be, because people just prefer cleaner sounding recordings. So we also need to be aware of different factors of speech and how to model them. On the TTS evaluation side, which will be relevant for TTS people here, this is not a new finding. This has been said over and over again, but I want to say it once more because it's really important. Any objective TTS evaluation metric needs to be tested and retested in any new case that we want to apply it to. So if we want to evaluate children's speech, we need to actually run some subjective evaluation as well on children's speech and actually compare our objective evaluation to it for it to be any use, and especially if we use supervised methods like MOS prediction. And at least with our distributional approach, we did find the most robust metric, but again, this needs to be verified for more domains and so forth. And finally, this was also said at SSW, we presented part of this work, and I also want to restate it. I don't think anyone here is doing that, but just in case you see a paper or you get one to review, don't use frame-based algorithmic methods, still CP, SQ sometimes, or store and so forth. Don't use them anymore for evaluation, because sometimes you'd be better off if you just flip the sign in front. So that's really not a good metric anymore. So thank you very much, and I will be taking questions now. Yes?
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering how we collect all the most scores, because there seems to be many TTS models, right?
Yes. So for the first work, so the question was how do we collect all the MOS scores? Yeah. For the first round of TTSDS, we used existing data sets that had MOS ratings already. So in that case, that was the Blizzard 2008 challenge, the Back to the Future paper that redid this challenge with more modern system, and TTS Arena, which used an ELO-based score. So there we already had the ratings. For our second round of TTSDS, we actually ran the subjective listening tests ourselves with 50 raters per domain, and those three different metrics that are showed, which is MOS, CMOS, and SMOS. And with 50 raters, we should be well within the range where we can actually find get a good ranking of all these models. And we found that there were also most were statistically significant differences between the rankings, although some were ambiguous, as you have with most of these subjective listening tests. Yeah, that answers it. Yes?
Thanks for the talk. I guess my question is regarding what is the objective here? Because obviously real speech and syntax speech distribution will always be different for all machine learning problems.
Yeah.
But for the specific task of TTS for ASR, don't we actually just want TTS to be able to generate more diverse distributions than the current real speech, and that will serve as a data augmentation for ASR tasks?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You can, that's a great question, so I'll just repeat it for the recording. Is basically if the objective isn't for TTS for ASR, doesn't really necessarily align with matching the distributions exactly, because we just want a distribution that is good for the ASR task. So here we really saw TTS for ASR as a proxy task. There are other ways, because intuitively, for example, even if we take real speech to train an ASR system and we add data augmentation, that's obviously pushing it outside of the real data distribution, but it still improves ASR. So obviously it cannot always be the goal to just match the distribution exactly. But we used it as a proxy task with the assumption that, so the end goal here is to actually quantify the distribution between the data, because it will be useful for evaluation and for saying how well these models can actually reproduce the real distribution. And for TTS for ASR, the hypothesis, if they were able to do this perfectly, then we would get good results, even though potentially we could get even better results if it was unnatural in the right way, right? So that's why we can also can't use TTS for ASR as our only evaluation method, because it only tells us if the best case scenario is met, but then if it diverges from the real data, we cannot actually say why. And it could also, it's also not a good metric, because it could go the other way. It could actually perform better with synthetic data than with real data if it's changed in the right way. So we really, to make it short, we really see it as a proxy task for this kind of evaluation, this distributional evaluation. Yeah?
Just a follow-up, because
of course.
TTS literature has deviated from any of the distribution matching objective here.
Yes.
Yeah. Pretty much in an LM-based TTS, we're just trying to generate as diverse as possible. Just do any type of like sampling and all these sort of things. And then we also introduced the post-training, which we are not aiming to match the synthetic speech distribution with the real data, but rather we're just to narrow the distribution to be like a subset of the real data distribution. And a lot of the models you've already evaluated, especially in TTSDS, is they have instruction generation, they have post-training RL, and all of these are not really trying to match the distribution to be the same, just to be a, like synthetic, to be a narrow, natural subset of the
Yeah, that's a good point. And of course, we don't have a perfect answer for this. We're just trying to make incremental progress. I don't think that distributional evaluation is like the end-all be-all for all use cases. But what we did show is that it does actually correlate with perception in some important ways. But again, it is not. I do not want to misstate that it's the end goal to always match the real distribution perfectly. But I think it's also, on one hand, there's the usefulness of this distributional evaluation, which we have shown exists. But I do still think that on a philosophical and theoretical level, it would be interesting to quantify why do we not capture the full distribution, or in what systematic ways do we not capture the full distribution, even if it's not always the end goal, for practical reasons, if that makes sense. Yeah?
I have a question about, so trying to understand, like, for the word error ratio at the very beginning, is it a higher, better, or?
No, the lower the ratio is, the closer we are to an equal. We basically want both terms to be the same, to be perfect, because then the word error rate of the synthetically trained model would be the exact same as the word error rate for the model trained on real speech. So a ratio of 1 would be perfect, right? That means that the model that's trained on synthetic speech matches the model trained on real speech exactly, and it's just 1 to 1. Yeah.
The goal is not to, for instance, improve ASR. It's just more like measuring whether the ASR models have trained on the same distribution.
So here it's just a hypothesis is if the distribution behave the same for ASR training, then we should in the end get the same word error rate, which means we would get a value of 1. Sorry, I did not check online if there were any questions. So feel free to unmute yourself or put it in chat if I can actually open up chat, I'm not sure. Actually unmute yourself if you have any questions online, because I can't see the chat right now. Okay. Any more questions in the room otherwise? Then thank you very much.